Greetings, guys. We're going to entitle this video Legal Courtroom Scene and Deathblow to Past 80-70 Judgment. Romans chapter 8 verse 33 and 34. Who will bring a charge against God's elect? God is the one who justifies. Who is the one who condemns? Christ Jesus is he who died, yes, rather, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who also intercedes for us. The passage under consideration is very destructive to full preterism, as was Mike Tyson was to the heavyweight division. This is mainly for two reasons. First, Romans 8:33 through 34 is a highly eschatological, or in a highly eschatological context in Romans. And second, the courtroom language in the Greek has this as the future judgment brought into the here and now, into the justified sinner's life. In other words, if the judgment has taken place in the past, in AD 70, then there can be no justification for sinners at the present moment. This is a future verdict of not guilty and pronounced righteous for the sake of the merits of Christ being brought into the here and now. There is no justification without this future judgment verdict. This text is even more damaging than Romans chapter 3, 19 through 26 and 5, 9 through 10, which would be a parallel passage on the doctrine of justification. Our first point is the context. It must be remembered the eschatology is just coming into the forefront in chapter 8 of Romans. This is significant as Paul places the passage under consideration smack dab in the middle of it all. In Romans 8:10, verse 8:10 through 11, Paul speaks of the resurrection of the Romans, quote, mortal bodies, by the same Spirit that raised Christ. Next, in verse 17, he speaks of them as heirs. In Romans 8:18 through 24, he talks of the not yet of adoption. He speaks of glorification, the recreation, and resurrection. Romans 8:29 through 30, Paul speaks of what the Reformed would call the golden chain of redemption, or as I prefer to call the Ordo Salutis. In verse 29, he mentions being conformed to the image of his Son as the goal of all salvation, which is glorification and resurrection. In verse 30, he mentions those who would be glorified. Then we have our passage, verse 33 and 34. And finally, in verse 38, after speaking of persecutions, tribulation, etc., we will not keep the persecutions, tribulations, etc., will not keep the elect from the love of God. Also in verse 38, he states, quote, nor things to come. Then, of course, we get into Romans chapter 9 through 11, which, of course, is eschatological. So very clearly and distinctly, we see our present passage is an eschatological one, with our second point laying the hammer down. At this juncture, we will hit on the second reason for why this text is a savage against full preterism by examining it grammatically. We will quote the Greek scholars and lexicons to first establish the courtroom language behind the Greek, which is also apparent in the English translation. And you're going to be blown away by the Greek from Baghdad, that lexicon. You're going to be blown away in a second here. First off, A.T. Robertson states, who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? Future active indicative of charge, old verb to come forward as an accuser. Forensic term, that's legal term, courtroom term. In case, in court, to impeach, as in Acts 19:40, 23, 29, 26, and to the only New Testament example. Satan is the great accuser of the brethren according to his plan for justification, Romans 3:21 through 31. The accuser must face the judge with his charges, Romans 8:34. Then he says, shall condemn, can either be present active participle, condemns, or the future, shall condemn. Future, it shall condemn. It is a bold accuser who can face God with false charges, or with true ones, for that matter, for we have an advocate at God's court, 1 John 2:1, who is at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. Robinson, in his Greek English lexicon, states to accuse, arrange, bring a charge against, foil, etc. Gerald Gregg, in his commentary on Romans, states, in this passage we have the accuser, or the one bringing a charge against God's elect. We also have the accused party, the elect believer, the judge, God who is the one who justifies. And finally, we have a lawyer present, our high priest making intercession with the blood of his atonement. We have a similar passage in 1 John 1 and 2. So this is courtroom. This is the last judgment. It's as simple as that. Lawyer, judge, accused, condemned. This is the last judgment. Same as Romans chapter 3, 21 through 26. Now, get this now. Here we go. N.T. Wright, from his massive commentary on Romans concerning our present text, quote, whatever we think about what verse 33 through 34, we are back to the law court, as in the middle of chapter 3. In 2:1 through 16, the whole family faced the judgment of God. In 3:19 through 20, the whole world was on the dock, with no defense to offer against massive charges. Now we look around for possible accusers and find none. Any that may appear have to face the fact that God, the judge, is the justifier. In other words, that the verdict has already been pronounced by the judge whose righteousness has been fully displayed. And the verdict that those in the Messiah, marked out by faith, are already seen as righteous, even ahead of the final vindication. The final vindication, you get that? Did you catch the power of that? Is precisely what the law court dimension of justification is all about. We should note at this point Paul is once again speaking of the final day of judgment, as chapter 2, 1 through 16, and 8, verse 1. And he looks ahead to the future moment and puts his confidence in the past event of justification, and hence the present standing of God's people that results from it. Knowing that God, quote, those that God justified, God also glorified. The logic of justification comes full circle. And that's from his massive commentary on Romans. Robert Mounts, in his standard work on Romans, states the following: the Greek word for charge, ekleo, to bring a charge, is a legal technical term to bring in a charge against someone in a court of law. Bagged, page 215, and that's the standard work today, lexicon. Used here in the future tense, it points to the final judgment. Robert Mounts and N.T. Wright both state, because of the Greek of the text, it is the final judgment brought into the here and now. This is what I have argued in the past, and I'm arguing presently again, because it can't be refuted. Greek scholar and apologist Dr. James White has written this generation's most important work on the doctrine of justification in The God Who Justifies. Dr. White, also beside the above, also shows the power of the Greek text in Romans 8:33 through 34. The phrase, quote, bring a charge, is a legal term. It is used in numerous ancient texts in this very context. At this point, Paul put this conversation squarely in the court of law To bring a charge against God's elect is to engage in formal legal proceedings. Paul's question is rhetorical, meant to indicate the impossibility of the proposed action. And so what I'm going to do is put this article underneath this video. You can read the quotes yourself. And I might even post the article to Romans chapter 3 that I did a 14-page article on Romans 3:21 through 26, which I developed the courtroom language as well. And so we see why this is destructive. Because it's the future judgment and justification being brought into the here and now. I've been saying that forever. Then I forgot about Romans chapter 8, which I put at the very end of my article on Romans 3, and so I decided to develop it tonight quite a bit. But that's probably about it there, guys. Thanks for watching.